Denial. Why it's a little bit different in dementia. If you haven't watched before, my name is Dr. Nicole Didick. I'm board certified in internal medicine and geriatric medicine. And for the last 20 years, I've had a practice where I look after older adults and their families. A big part of my practice is looking after people who are living with dementia. And I've noticed there are some key connections that if people who are living with someone who's living with dementia or even caring for somebody with dementia in a healthcare role or some other role, if you make those key connections and understand some really critical things about dementia, it can make that journey easier, or at least more understandable. The first thing I want to cover is this idea of denial. Most of us have some concept of what denial is, right? So it could be, for example, a classic one is when someone is given a diagnosis of a terminal illness or told that they're going to die. Denial is one of the first stages. So a person will just not really believe it. They will act as though it's not going to happen, just really push it out of their minds and behave like it never happened. That can happen in other situations too, less serious ones, of course. I think we all are sometimes using denial as a coping mechanism. I must be in denial about how much chocolate a human needs to eat because I seem to really overestimate that on a regular basis. That's kind of a silly example, but yeah, I'm in denial about that and it's not serving me well. It's a psychological mechanism that I'm using. In dementia, it's very common that a family member will tell me that, so say it's their dad or mom, they'll say, "Why is my dad in denial about his dementia?" Sometimes people will even make appointments with me because I will have seen their family member and made the diagnosis. And then a few months later, they'll bring their dad back in and say, "Look, you told him he had dementia those 3 months ago. You need to tell him again because he doesn't get it. He's acting like he doesn't have dementia and it's driving us nuts. So tell him again." And that's pretty common. And it really shows that this belief that the person who's living with dementia is in denial, it's problematic. Another example is if the person who's living with dementia is developing a belief that doesn't line up with reality. It might be that they think their cleaning lady is sneaking in at night and moving things around again, or that the person is being poisoned, or that even though their son is visiting every day, he never comes to see them. And those are probably getting into what we would call a delusion, which is a false belief that's very, very fixed and that's very hard for a person to shake. But it can also seem a bit like denial. It's kind of along that same line of not having insight. And that's the key. A person who's living with dementia, most types of dementia, especially Alzheimer's, will almost always, at some point, develop changes in their ability to have insight. The person who's living with dementia does not realize that their brain is letting them down. They don't realize that that belief that their son is never there isn't true. And no amount of reminding or reorienting can convince the person with dementia otherwise. It usually just leads to arguments. And that can really affect your relationship with your dad. Let's just talk about that in a bit more detail. The parts of our brain that are affected by Alzheimer's control things like insight and judgment and executive reasoning, as well as short-term memory. And when we combine all of those things, we might think that even though we've just had a visit with our son, it never happened. In the moment, we were enjoying that visit and we were present, but because of the short-term memory and the other deficits, as soon as that visit is over, it never happened. And so if that's something that I really value, I'm going to get angry and say, why didn't you come to see me? Memory changes can sometimes be a little bit patchy. So we might have remembered that you said you were going to come over, but then why didn't you? And convincing the person, or even like showing them a video of the visit or a tape recording or, evidence that you were there, that's usually not helpful. And that's the thing too, with when their reality doesn't line up with your reality, even if you were to, do that, they would say, well, that was from another visit, or, well, you doctored those records to show that you were actually there. So it kind of, everything will kind of line up with their version of events. I guess what I'm getting at is these changes are part of the dementia. They're part of the brain changes. It's not something that the person with dementia is doing deliberately to upset themselves or to upset you. It's a part of the brain changes. And usually the person with dementia is doing their best to navigate the world, but the world is just not making as much sense because the brain is letting the person down. If your dad is living with dementia and he doesn't acknowledge that he is, and maybe is accusing other people of doing things or not doing things that don't line up with reality, understanding that it's not on purpose, it's because of his brain changes, I think that's a key thing to know. And you might even need to be reminded of that every once in a while. It's still hard. So if you've spent a long time visiting with someone and they forget all about it very quickly, that's really frustrating and heartbreaking. It's still really hard. And even if, we can say to ourselves, well, it's the dementia. I know that's why it's happening. I know that he can't help it. I know he's doing his best. Knowing that is really important, but it's still difficult. What it will do, though, is 3 things. If you understand that the person who's living with dementia doesn't have insight, they're not in denial, and they're not doing it on purpose, then you will avoid arguments. You don't have to go into the person's delusion, in detail and start elaborating on it and but you can validate that that is the way that they see the world. You can validate and then maybe try to distract the person. Move on to an activity or a topic that's really pleasant and that does not involve that specific area that they're concerned about. The second thing that'll happen when you realize that the person doesn't have insight and they can't help it is that you might stop resenting them. If we think that somebody is in denial and they're just deliberately being stubborn or difficult to make our lives harder, that could lead us to resentment. I think it's natural to feel resentful. And if we understand that it's because of the brain disorder, the person's doing their best, it's a lot harder to feel that resentment, at least resentment towards the person. You can resent the heck out of Alzheimer's. That's totally fair. Having Alzheimer's, we can get mad at Alzheimer's and say this darn disease is, making us have this misunderstanding. It's okay to resent Alzheimer's, but to resent the person because of the symptoms of their disease isn't really fair. And usually I find when we understand why things are the way they are and why the behavior is that way, it's easier to move past that resentment. The third thing is a little more subtle, but it's, I find myself giving this advice a lot in the office. You won't necessarily put the person in the position of making a decision that is not something they can really make. So, for example, I will recommend sometimes a day program. So I'll say, it would be really good if your dad would go to the day program once a week. There's a meal there, there's physical activity, he can make some friends, and it would also give you a break because he would be there for most of the day once a week, and you would have that time to do the things you need to do to look after your own health. And sometimes the care partner will say, well, he doesn't want to go. Or I asked him and he said, no, he doesn't need that because he doesn't have Alzheimer's. And I'm not saying we don't want to give decision-making capacity to people living with dementia. I think we should as much as we can. But if it's in an area where the person doesn't have complete insight because of the disease, then I think it's okay to work around the person. I think it's okay to just say, well, you know what, we're going to try this day program today. Kind of take that step out of giving the person the opportunity to say they don't want to go, or to present it in a way that like, well, why would I need that if I don't have dementia? Just to kind of say, this is a great program, as a family, where the best thing for us right now is for you to check out this program. It's really good. It's free or whatever it is. And I think that can be a major step. So not always deferring to the person who's living with dementia, because they might not be able to really judge what the best course of action is. Not because they're incompetent or not intelligent. Maybe their whole life they have been the person that everybody has deferred to. But with the brain changes, that might not be the best way to go. So those are the things that I think can be a little easier when we make that, when we realize that the person with dementia has a change in insight. They have this anosognosia, so they don't know that they don't know. And, me as a professional telling them they have dementia or telling them that they're wrong about something, that's not going to work either. And getting into an argument isn't going to work. It's just going to lead to pain and friction in the relationship. Does that make sense to you? Thinking about your experiences with people living with dementia, have you noticed that there are changes in insight, and how did you handle it? I hear about this every day in my office, but I'd like to hear what your experience has been too, because I can always learn from these kind of interactions here on The Wrinkle. We're going to talk more about the key connections that you can make about dementia that will make looking after or living with someone with dementia a lot easier. If you want to connect with me, I'm on Facebook and Twitter and here on YouTube. I also have a website, thewrinkle.ca, and almost everything that's on YouTube is there as well. And there are places to leave comments, which I love to read. And you can sign up for my newsletter so that you never miss a thing on The Wrinkle. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time.